Okay, so hi everyone. Just as a brief introduction, I wanted to go through and introduce everyone to our panel of nurse leaders today, in addition to myself, the host. We are going to be talking about transactional and transformational leadership in nursing and healthcare specifically. And we all have a little bit to add to this just because we have all kind of lived and breathed this as bedside nurses. So to start off with myself, my name is Jessica Forrest. I'm the host of this podcast. My experience is in pediatric hematology and oncology. I worked as a bedside nurse for about 4 years, and now I work in the pharmaceutical industry, working as a nurse educator to other pediatric hematology and oncology nurses with an immunotherapy product. Moving on to our producer, Zyrene Marsh. Zyrene is a family nurse practitioner at a rural primary healthcare setting in Southwest Iowa. She serves as a as a provider team lead within their practice, and she has developed community-based programs to address social determinants of health within their community. Moving on to our two researchers, we have first Elizabeth Rumley. Elizabeth is in the MSN program here at Johns Hopkins in organizational leadership. She graduated from Georgetown University with a BSN in 2008, and she had previously earned a Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology and a BA in English. She has been a certified critical care nurse since 2014 and has worked in the ICU for 12 years. During that time, she's conducted original qualitative research on heart failure education and has made contributions to the Innovations Program at St. Luke's Hospital of Kansas City. Lastly, we have our last nurse leader, which is Kendall Conolly. Kendall is a current bedside nurse in acute medicine and telemetry at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. She lives in Baltimore, Maryland. So that's going to be our panel today, and we are going to be talking to you all about contemporary leadership theories, as mentioned before. Specifically, we're going to be talking about transformational and transactional leadership. Contemporary theories, leadership theories, are built upon both traits and behaviors exhibited by leaders in today's modern healthcare system. While these are not exhaustive, this list, common contemporary theories used today include transformational and transactional approaches. So for the purpose of today's podcast, we are going to define and discuss both of those theories as they are applied to our current healthcare system and all of our personal nursing experiences. During our discussion, we will speak to 3 different nurse leaders who we just introduced you to, who will highlight their own experiences with these theories and answer the following questions. The first being, what are some examples of transformational leaders and also transactional leaders in your personal healthcare experience? What was their experience with those types of leaders? The second question, how did those leaders impact them as a leader and also as a follower? The third question, how would they apply these leadership theories in their current roles? And lastly, what advice to future or aspiring nurse leaders might these nurse researchers have? So before we get into that discussion with our panel, I'm going to go ahead and give a brief overview of those contemporary leadership styles, specifically transformational and transactional leadership. So to start, let's examine what it means to be a transactional leader, or more so, what the transactional leadership theory is. To quote Borowski and Meese in Organizational Behavior Theory and Design in Healthcare, transactional leadership is directed towards task accomplishment and the maintenance of good relationships between the leaders and subordinates through consideration of performance and reward. This approach enables leaders to maintain status quo and will result in agreed upon rewards. Leaders who utilize this approach are quite task-focused and clarify clear expectancies, rules, and procedures to accomplish the goals at hand. This theory is concerned with exchange of rewards for effort, referred to as contingent reward, active watches and searches for deviation from rules and standards, and subsequent corrective action, referred to as management by exception. And more passive behaviors, such as intervening only if standards are not met, which is called passive management by exception. And lastly, transactional leaders abdicate responsibilities or avoidance of decision-making that can often be referred to as laissez-faire leadership. Our text states that this type of leadership is often and commonly found in healthcare, though when compared to transformational leadership, our text states that followers of transactional leadership often have a lower job satisfaction. Transactional leadership is more in line with the managerial thinking approach, tackling tasks to achieve productivity or prescribed goals. Sort of conversely to this type of management, this contemporary theory, type of leadership, this contemporary theory. Now we're going to talk about transformational leadership. Transformational leadership equips its leaders with trait-based approaches and theories to inspire and enact change. Transformational leadership is thought to include a reemergence of personality or trait-based theories, often associated with the Big Five personality framework, including which states that transformational leaders exhibit extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience as inherent personality traits. In contrast to transactional leadership, transformational leadership largely relies on the charisma and the inspiration of a leader to inspire followers towards a common goal. A transformational leader provides vision and a sense of mission. They instill pride and gain respect and trust of their followers. They exhibit intelligence, rationality, and careful problem-solving skills while giving personal attention and coaching to their employees. This style is directed toward institutional change through revitalization and vision. So as we mentioned, this is quite the opposite of transactional leadership, which is very much a reward-based theory, where this is really meant to inspire followers towards a common goal. While literature supports both of these contemporary styles as prevalent in our current healthcare system, the key difference between these two come from the experience of the styles as seen from their followers. As such, we're going to talk to our nurse experts now to further highlight these theories and talk about what their experience has been with them. So I'll go ahead and start with our first question with Kendall and Elizabeth. So the first question is, what are some examples of transformational leaders and also transactional leaders in your personal healthcare experience?
Hi, everyone. This is Kendall here. As Jessica said, I currently work on an acute medicine telemetry floor at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And in my 2 years there, I've experienced numerous management changes. My first manager was transferred to a different department, and in between my current manager and that manager, we had an interim manager. She also served as the progressive cardiac care unit manager, and pretty soon into knowing her, she seemed to display many qualities of a transactional leader. Her introduction to the unit was to have one-on-ones with all of us, which was really lovely. She heard our concerns and desires for change on the unit and definitely appeared empathetic at first, but she also made it clear that she was tasked to keep us afloat, not necessarily shape a vision for the unit. So she empowered leadership we already had on the unit. However, she definitely focused on budgetary concerns and staffing of the unit, mostly to save the transformational work for her own unit. In this regard, I found that she was pretty task oriented and was seeming to reward us with stability on the unit. Fortunately, now we have a leader who's much more transformational. And from the beginning, she's been clear about her vision for the unit, which has included a positive unit culture, wanting to make nurses feel drive to excel, feel supported, and hold each other accountable with the ultimate goal of making each other to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Kendall. It sounds like you had a better personal experience with the more transformational style versus the transactional. So thank you for sharing that. Elizabeth, do you want to open up and tell us a little bit about your experience with that same question?
Yes, I'm Elizabeth, and I'm going to first describe a transformational relationship that I had. And actually, when I was reviewing all of my managers that I've had over the 12 years, the woman who stuck out to me as being the most transformational in my nursing career is actually a research mentor. Her name is Dr. Jackie Carpenter. And I think what was so transformational about my relationship with her is that she applied such high value to my own original ideas. And even those that I would like wax and wane over, I think the fact that she applied meaning to it really subsequently led me to apply meaning to them. And with that, I was able to pursue them, and it resulted in doing some really interesting research. Without that sort of like boost in confidence, I'm not quite sure that that would have happened. We talk about the 5 fundamentals of leadership, of transformational leadership, and she really did kind of hit the nail on the head of all 5 that were mentioned in some of our readings. One time I was having a conversation with her and she was describing her own research. And I said, gosh, Jackie, I said, this is so impressive. I'm kind of wondering why you're sitting here having a conversation with me about all this. And she said, Elizabeth, I'm a nurse who helps nurses. And right then and there, she kind of like our visions sort of aligned and it was very inspirational because the research that I was doing really was about nurses. And it was kind of at this beautiful intersection of, she's doing something like her vision is to help nurses. And the research I was doing was to ultimately help nurses as well. So we'll move on to a transactional leader that I had in my life. Actually, this was my very first manager straight out of nursing school. And I will say, I think, you move a couple decades back that this type of leadership was much more common. She actually was a very hardworking manager. And that's what I remember of her. She was very hardworking. She moved up the chain in the hospital. She could be a little intimidating. There was a lot of, you complete this task and then, maybe you will move up to RN1 or RN2, and then you can get, a small increase in pay. There were some of those that made a lot of sense, like earning, pay for getting your CCRM, which is something I completely agree with. I think the thing that was one of the greatest struggles when you have a purely transactional leader is that it sometimes can lead to meaningless work. And ultimately when you're conducting meaningless work, personally, I feel like that says something about the value of your time. If you're spending your time doing something that doesn't hold inherent meaning, then it's almost speaking to how you value your time or how you don't value your time. So when I go back and I think about the, impactful leaders in my life, both the transformational and the transactional, those are the two that come to mind.
Awesome. Elizabeth, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate what you mentioned in terms of valuing time. I think in my own experience, I've certainly felt that transactional leaders, they don't necessarily see the why behind what we're doing. And I feel like that really goes back to valuing time and valuing the efforts we're going towards. And as you mentioned, the kind of the opposite of that is your transformational leader who mentioned, she really wants to be a nurse who helps nurses. I think that's the complete antithesis of probably what you felt from that transactional leader. So really, thank you. That's a great way to get us started with this conversation. Let's go ahead and move on to the second question. So you both have kind of touched on this, but maybe we could elaborate a bit further. How did those leaders impact you as a leader or as a follower? Whether you want to talk about the transformational impact or the transactional impact, how did those really make you feel as a follower in those scenarios?
Jessica, you picked up on it for sure when I was speaking to the transactional leader that I worked under, my interim manager. It was certainly difficult. I think our unit definitely required stability with regards to unit staffing and finances. However, for over a year having a leader like that, it resulted in some differences in opinions. I found that her delegation of interpersonal discrepancies on the unit, for example, to be somewhat avoidant when those tasks were delegated to other unit leader. You're supposed to look at your manager, your unit leadership as someone you can go to for everything. But when you have someone who's more transactional, those interpersonal matters might get pushed aside. And that's something that I found. And I think her goal of keeping the unit afloat was somewhat uninspiring. And I was a relatively new nurse. I was nursing, I think, for a year at that point, and I needed to feel inspired that I was a part of a team where everyone had a shared mutual vision. And at the same time, we're overlapping with the COVID-19 pandemic, and our unit was partially bio mode for a few weeks of that time period. So I needed to feel inspired, and I needed to feel that we also were working under the same vision for the unit. So now having a transformational leader, I can see how that has made a difference in my view of our unit, and it's impacted me tremendously. Whereas now I feel valued, appreciated, wanted on my team, and beyond the direct patient care, I feel like I'm a part of the change that's being created on the unit, both for myself and for my fellow coworkers.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Kendall. I hadn't even thought about, but I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of what does that leadership style trickle down to feel like in maybe an exceptionally hard circumstance like the COVID-19 pandemic, or when you're dealing with maybe some interpersonal, challenges with a coworker. That's when you really want to feel maybe that transformational style, or you want to feel that support. And it sounds like your experience with a transactional leadership was you felt stability, but not necessarily support. So
Absolutely.
that's a really interesting point. And thank you for sharing that. Elizabeth, what have been your experiences, as a follower with those two types of leaders who you described earlier?
Well, something that's interesting that I didn't actually even think of until now is it sounds like we both experienced transactional leadership before transformational leadership. And, I'm curious as to what our practices would have been like if it were the opposite. Just like with children, early experiences shape your brain and thus your behavior. And so, I experienced a transactional leader before, transformational one. And I think because of that, it kind of made it a little more difficult for me to go down sort of the unknown roads that I found curious. When you're a little unsure of yourself, which might come from a transactional leadership, because what you're doing, all the credit you're getting it because of like tasks you're checking off. It doesn't have much to do with like your own original thoughts and your own original ideas. So basically you're always speaking to someone else's format. You're never like really moving within your own format, within your own map. You're just kind of conforming to someone else's. And because of that, you kind of develop your own personal structure, and it's hard to reach out into the unknown opportunities. So I think, with the transactional leadership, it kind of slows everything down. It slows down. I think it slows down growth, because that's not what is like put forward. That's not seen as the primary goal. It's more about keeping the ship afloat as opposed to growing the ship, like you mentioned, Kendall. I will say with the transformational leader that I had, truly, and I'm not exaggerating this when I say it, but I really wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now if it were not for her. I said sometimes she's kind of like my own little Florence in my mind. She was incredibly inspirational, and really it kind of was like the giant kick in the pants to like go down this road that I had been like thinking about and pondering for a long time. So I do believe, like, as a nurse, it was 100% instrumental. And had I not experienced that relationship, I quite possibly may have been still like chugging along with these thoughts and ideas in the background and not pushing them forward. So those have been my experiences.
And I think that's so amazing, Elizabeth, because, like you mentioned, it sounds like that transformational leader truly did inspire you. She empowered you, which is the exact idea behind the theory, but you're sort of proof putting that you truly were inspired by this person to this common goal, and look at where the trajectory has taken you. So it's really an inspiring example personally, but also we can see really how that transformational style of leadership works. Not only is it maybe preferable as a follower, but it's also, can really make some differences in the trajectory of the nurses. So that's awesome. Thank you again for sharing. Our third question, is somewhat in that same vein, but maybe looking more towards, again, your future as our researchers, your future and where you see yourselves going. How would you apply these leadership theories in your current role or maybe a future role?
I see
Kendall,
myself as, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I
no,
see
go ahead.
myself as applying these leadership theories more in future roles. I have a few leadership experiences now on my unit, but I'm very much looking forward to completing my master's and focusing on academics so that I can eventually pursue leadership roles more formally. I believe that completion of tasks is obviously important, and we've seen that in transactional leadership. However, I think that more of those tasks get accomplished when you've delegated and inspired your team to complete them. For that reason, I think that you need to make your staff feel supported and valued, appreciated, that we're all working towards a collective goal. And that is really embracing the transformational leadership more than anything. And that is something I'd like to apply to my leadership style. I think that when you have an inspired, empowered unit, engaged unit, that you're getting those tasks accomplished and working towards like direct patient care that is backed by teamwork and mutual respect for one another. So by having a transformational leader share their vision, encourage participation on the unit, everyone's working to complete those tasks as opposed to just one transactional leader doing that.
Sure.
So moving forward, those are the things I would like to implement into my own leadership style.
Yeah, very, very awesome. Very cool to see that, moving forward as a leader in your own right, you'll really try to transform those around you. And because you see sort of the effect of that, right? You feel
Mm-hmm.
you feel inspired by a transformational leader to get tasks done. So you want to be kind of the same, which I think is awesome. Elizabeth, how do you see applying these theories and these concepts to your current and future roles?
I mean, let's see. So I think that applying the transformational form of leadership actually is much more my natural inclination. I don't really like micromanaging. I mean, it's not quite my style. And also I think it kind of pushes down like authentic success. And I think it's important to remember that transformational leadership, it's not passive. It's actually very intentional. I think what you need to do is you need to pay attention to even like the subtle changes in people who you're leading, and also like the talents. And so you're able to pull those out. So I think what I like experienced with the transformational leader really is how attuned she kind of stayed to me, how aware she was of my strengths and also my challenges. There were many times where she kind of would pull me back to center and be like, okay, that does not matter right now. Like, let's refocus and move forward. And in order to do that, you really have to be connected to whomever you're leading. So those are things that I would like to pull together and contribute to my own leadership in the future. I do believe that there is a place for transactional leadership. I do believe that when it is sort of couched inside transformational leadership, it's just fine. And I use the example of being compensated for a CCRN. Even our reading, it references how, transactional relationship is actually augmented when it's used within a transformational like structure. And, you can if you are compensated for, let's say, your CCRN and something like that, actually, it's acknowledgement. It's like unambiguous acknowledgement for what you have done. And so it kind of takes on a transformational quality to it. So, although, as long as it is used sparingly, transactional leadership can work well as long as it's couched in transformational leadership. And so I believe finding a balance in there is something that I strive to do.
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned that because, our text does state that exact kind of concept that transactional leadership does happen quite a bit in healthcare. And I have to think, Elizabeth, that it might be in that scenario you just described, which is, there are rewards and compensations that are built into us being healthcare professionals, that does play a role and that does have a place, to be sure. But like you say, it maybe is inside of a transformational approach, as opposed to primarily just being transactional. So I'm glad you brought that up. The last question I have for you guys, before we sort of summarize and wrap up with Zyrene, my last question is, what advice do you have for future or aspiring nurse leaders, after your own experiences and maybe what we've learned about these two theories? What kind of advice do you have?
Elizabeth said it great earlier. Transactional leadership definitely worked at one point. It was popular and certainly necessary. However, the profession is moving to a place where transformational leadership is more important than ever. We have this post-pandemic culture, we have a worsening nursing shortage, and other changes that the industry is experiencing require a high morale, teamwork, and positive nursing culture. That's the only way we're going to combat what's going on around us. And I think that transformational leadership is really what creates that change. We're also learning more and more about nurse burnout and what prevents that. I would argue that transformational leadership is really what's going to prevent that, because you need a leader that can identify signs of burnout on their staff, raise them up, and remind them of what we're doing. It's about the patients, it's about the teamwork dynamic, and how we're all working towards a goal of bettering, CAUTI prevention, CLABSI prevention, whatever the unit's working on. And hopefully that's multiple projects. But in addition to providing quality care, we're also working to create all of this change, and change that's going to directly impact our patients, information that we can share with other units, other hospitals. We're creating change in all sorts of different ways as nurses and as nurse leaders. And we need to be reminded of why we're doing that. So my advice for future leaders is inspire those around you to work towards the vision that you share. That is how we can prevent issues related to the nursing shortage and post-pandemic culture.
That is so poignant, and so I think what every nurse entering the field needs to hear right now. So thank you so much for sharing that, Kendall. It's always at the end of the day sort of about our patients, right? And even with the example of CLABSIs, we want our patients to never have a CLABSI, but sometimes our leaders can get very focused on the nuts and bolts of not preventing CLABSIs, and that can feel very transactional, right? So really refocusing that intention of, this is really for a greater good. This is for our patients, I think is spot on with what you're describing of what our leaders should be doing. So thank you so much for that advice. Elizabeth, anything for you to add in terms of what advice you have for future nurses?
Yes, and I think what you guys are talking about is so applicable right now. I think what you mentioned about nurse burnout. And think about it. How many times have you heard like your coworkers say, "Gosh, I really, really love nursing, but I just don't like my job." And I'm like, that doesn't have to be. And so I think now more than ever, like you mentioned, Kendall, like we do need to have a huge push towards transformational leadership. And what I would say to new nurses or other people looking down this road really is to stay alert, to your own observations and thoughts and ideas. If you're alert to your own, then you can be alert to other people. I think especially in this day and age, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have so much that is emerging. I think, around every corner in nursing, there is an opportunity for leadership. So I think if you harness your own ideas and are also, remain like open and willing to receive those of others, just then and there, you're taking like the first steps into leading this profession to great achievements. And also the last thing is that, I would advise people to, or nurses, don't totally define yourself as what you thought like a good nurse would be. 2 seconds you stepped out of like taking your boards, because you're gonna grow so much, and your growth will work with your leadership pursuits, but also your leadership pursuits are going to be dependent on the growth of yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I relate to that so much too, Elizabeth, because, the nurse I thought I was going to be, like you say, right after you get that, pass on NCLEX, that's shaping, it's always shaping, that's always evolving, and really being able to mold with that and be flexible and understand that your interests are going to change and really bring that into the leader you want to be, I think is so important. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Zyrene, I'm going to hand it over to you for maybe a summary of what we've all discussed, and really be able to put a bow on this great discussion we've had.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you so much to our nurse researchers, Kendall and Elizabeth, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Jess, for facilitating this podcast. It seems like with all of this discussion that we've had today, there's a very clear theme of which leadership style or theory is more favorable at this point in time that we're, in healthcare. That complexity of healthcare system definitely calls for more adaptive leaders. And as Elizabeth and Kendall have pointed out, organizations will benefit from, both kinds of leaders to drive changes among individuals to promote organizational goals. But then we have to also remember that each type of leadership theory can have a pro or a benefit and a disadvantage to them. So wrapping it up, it sounds like transformational leadership is more favorable because it gives more interpersonal support to affect change to individuals within the organization. And as Elizabeth and Kendall mentioned, there's this long-lasting effect that more novice nurses get from those kind of leaders, which I think is very important in this time and age where we have a lot of nurses that are being burnt out, from this pandemic and all the mental health issues going around them. So I think being one of those kind of leaders will be very, very helpful in the healthcare system as we move forward from this pandemic. And on the other hand, we have transactional leaders, which usually would have benefits as well to unit operations and productivity, but it does not always guarantee employee morale due to lack of individual growth. Although I would say that in my line of practice, it's good to have both, to keep it balanced, to make sure that we're still, achieving the goals and the mission while taking care of our own employees. So I think it's just a matter of balancing everything, but definitely in this time and age that we're all living in right now and we're all practicing in, we're in a very tough spot being nurses or advanced practice nurses. So we really need to lean on those transformational leadership skills and values in order for us to continue to inspire others and to drive changes within our organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for summarizing that, Zyrene. I think that's, I couldn't have said it any better. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this today. Thank you so much, Kendall and Elizabeth, for your perspectives and for your interaction for this podcast. And with that, I will go ahead and sign off. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.